Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in our weekly study that we are doing in Hebrew Word Study. And we are in 1 Samuel chapter 30 and picking up with the 18th verse. And just a quick intro here, reminding us that we're following the life of David as the kingship is soon to be taken from Saul and given to David. And David had just escaped from having to participate with the Philistines in a battle against Israel. And during that time, the city of Ziklag, where David had been given and was his city where his men and family lived, has been plundered and burned to the ground, and his wife, all the children, all of their belongings had been taken captive. And David was chasing after them. God intervened and helped them have a victory where they were fighting for long periods of time with no sleep. But if you remember, there were 200 men who grew weary from the previous fighting and could not continue. Well, now they're regrouping. They're coming back together. And so the 400 men that went with David came back to the 200 men who had been set beside them to kind of watch the stuff they had. And there's this interchange here of what do you do now? They had recovered. They got quite a bounty. God allowed them to recover all of the children, the women, and so that's where we pick up today in verse 18. And so it says, David recovered all that had been carried away by the Amalekites and also his two wives. And verse 19, nothing was lacking, small or great, sons or daughters, and spoil or anything that was taken from them, David recovered. And even though it doesn't say in here, we know that this was a miraculous event. The fact that his children, there were young girls and young boys and their wives had not been harmed, had not been violated in any way, that all the stuff that was taken, they recovered all of it. None of it had been destroyed or used up or consumed. Again, this is quite remarkable because we know that war in itself and the people who do these things are not nice people. They are not respectful people. They are plunderers and pillagers, and they do harm, and they're just not in a respectful mindset whatsoever. We've seen some of that just looking at the way the war is going on between Russia and the Ukraine in how the reported stories of the Russian soldiers brutalizing the women and the men and and taking advantage of the children. You can imagine this was in that same realm of warfare, if not even worse, back in those days. So for David to get all of this back, it's again a miracle unspoken of, at least until we get a little further into the story. So verse 20, along with what he recovered that was of their own, there appears to also have been a large amount of herds and flocks and other belongings that these Amalekites had taken from the other cities that they had pillaged. And so they had quite a stash. And so David recovered all of those things too. And so verse 20 gives us a little bit about it, information about it. And it said, this is David's spoil, which is kind of interesting word play here, in that it is designed to tell us that it wasn't all due to David. It wasn't automatically that he received it all and it was his personally, but this was his to make sure it was divided properly. And it fell his responsibility to make sure that all was given in its proper perspective and proper location. And here's where kind of the fun begins. So we get to verse 21, and as David greets them, he came to the 200 men who had been weary and could not follow. They stayed at the brook Besor, and they went out to meet him. And it's kind of a double meeting. If you read the words here, it sounds a little redundant. So went out David to meet. So they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when they came near to David and the people, he greeted them, and it says he saluted them. But this word translated as salute is lamed, shin, lamed, vav, mem sofit, which is pronounced shalom. And you may be familiar with what the word shalom means, and that is peace. And the lamed in the front is a preposition that means two or four. So he greeted them to peace or for peace. Maybe it was just a common salutation in that day, but I think this gives us a little bit of insight to say that something unpeaceful is about to happen, and that their goal is to establish peace. And you'll see that play out. So as we look at verse 22, this salutation here did not have the desired effect on some of the men who were in David's group of his soldiers. Now remember, when David first formed his army, it said that men came from all over the countryside, those that were wanted fugitives, those that were disgruntled, the miscontents, anybody who couldn't fit along anywhere else joined with David. So he really had we'll use the term ragtag rabble that he commanded. They were obviously very valiant men, very dedicated to serving David, but it doesn't appear that they had a relationship with God the way David had. And again, some of these alliances are quite interesting. And even to think of alliances in different days and different times of men that God may use in certain situations who really do not have any form of godliness or any alliance or devotion to God, but yet they are willing to follow a person who may be called of God or may not, but to accomplish God's plan and purpose. And so we see this come out here, this little bit of a uprising. So these men, and it's interesting what the Bible, how it describes him. Um, he uses the word Ra, which is Resh Ayin, and it's pronounced R-A, Ra. There's a number of words in Hebrew that are called Ra words, and they're all associated with wickedness and evil and doing bad things. And so the Bible calls these people Ra, but then it even makes them a little bit level even worse, and it calls them worthless men. But this is the word of Bali, which is where we get the word of a taskmaster or someone who's very untouched by emotions of kindness or benevolence. It's someone who will want to be in power and want to have his own way, and he doesn't care who he steps on or who he trods under. When we had the story about Nabal, who is Abigail's husband, that's very similar word type that is aligned with his name of being someone who was heartless, Bible says worthless, having no humanity side to him at all. So these were really tough people. And you can imagine with the battles that they've been in and how they killed everyone involved, they really had no compassion left to them in their heart. And so here it was playing out that they didn't want to have any compassion towards these 200, that they kind of felt abandoned them and left all the work to them just because they were weak to go on, and they weren't going to give them any benevolence. They weren't going to give them anything other than, as they said here in verse 20, we'll give them their wife and kids back, but we're keeping all their stuff. And then at verse 22 ends, said, let them get out of here. We don't even want them to be part of us anymore. Let them depart and go their own way. We don't want them as part of our group. But verse 23, David comes in. And again, it shows, we know David had a different heart. He had a heart after God. And so he is trying to tell them what really happened here. And David says, Vayomer David means he spoke, and he says, you're not going to do this. My brothers, he calls them, and trying to pull a unity and alliance together within the ranks and keep them from fragmenting. And then he says, Natan Yahweh Lanu Vayishmor, that God has given, Natan, which is the word where Nathan comes from, means God has given, and God has preserved. Two beautiful words in the scriptures, Natan and Shemer, and here it's in the future tense, but then negated and made into past tense by the vav conversive, so it's a vayishmor. A little bit of Hebrew grammar there for you. And so it says that God has given and God has preserved us. So it's really God that has helped us, helped our troop when they came against us. Do you remember how you fought for 24 hours straight and made it for 36 hours without sleeping and didn't get tired and God protected you? That's really what he's trying to remind them of. And then verse 24, he offers them a challenge, kind of like saying, okay, so who's going to talk about this? Um, and the Hebrew goes like this, Umi Yishma, so that Yishma comes from the word of the Hebrew verse of Deuteronomy 6 and 4 of Shema, to listen, and heed, Lachem Ladavar, which is words from the heart. It's translated as matter, but these are deep matters. This is not a frivolous or trivial matter. These are very deep matters. And who is going to listen? And who is going to let this situation of what I just told you change your behavior, which is what shamar means. It's not just hearing, but it's hearing and taking heed to. So David is reminding them. They would have known this word Shema from the Deuteronomy 6 and 4 of Shema Yisrael. And so it would have maybe pricked them a little bit, and eventually this does get through to them. And so he makes a decree here in verse 24 that whoever has any part of the battle, whether they're fighting on the front lines or stays by the supplies, they're going to share and share alike, kind of like the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. And he made this an ordinance in Israel and a statute to this day. Now, the commentators will be quick to remind us that this is not the first time something like this happened, that in the book of Numbers, chapter 31 and verse 27, Moses, when he was leading the armies of Israel, had a very somewhat similar situation where some had to stay behind and take care of the baggage, and likewise, they were all included with the spoils and the return, and they were not trivialized because they couldn't carry on. But the difference there is Israel had not been set up as a kingdom or a nation. And so also Moses did not make a decree that this should be something that was followed forever and ever, but David did, and he made this a statute forever. Then we see some diplomacy coming in here with David when you look at the rest of the verses in this chapter from verse 26 through verse 31. David knows that the kingdom is coming into his hands very shortly, and he has been kind of on the fringe. He left Israel, he aligned himself with the Philistines, and now he's trying to play some diplomacy here to cement relationships, secure friendships, bring these alliances back together, smooth over any hard feelings that may have arisen. David was living with his men by pillaging and marauding other cities, and he wanted to make sure that his friends did not take any offense at what he did, whether it was going to the Philistines or whether it was breaking from Saul or whether it was pillaging some of these other cities. He wanted to bring them into his friendship circle again. So how do you do that? You give them gifts. And he good leader knows how that works. And so he sent gifts to all these cities. It kind of shows you how much loot he must have acquired from conquering these Amalekites, more than what he would have had in his city of Ziklag, that he was able to go to these key cities that are listed here and give them gifts and build his relationship and bring them into good favor with himself, and thereby setting the stage for David ascending to the throne and pulling all Israel back together again as a unified kingdom. So that's where we're going to leave off today with the end of chapter 30. I hope you enjoyed that and kind of see through here the mercies of God working through David in some circumstances that are, of course, very difficult for us to even wrap our thoughts around and put ourselves in the place of what was it like to be there? What was it like to be with David's men and see God work a miracle, but yet you're fighting and you're doing things that we in our heart can't even relate to or maybe even don't condone because of the violence involved there, and try to understand the time and the situation that this was in was much different than what we live in here today, and but yet bring it into an understanding that God was working through them in where they lived. He worked through them in their culture and in their time frame, and with the limited understanding that they had and the limited knowledge of God and of God's laws that they had. Um, Again, very challenging at times for us to see that. But I hope you got a little bit of insight through this study. Pray God's blessing upon you the rest of the study and through this week, and look forward to seeing you again next week. God bless you all. Bye bye.